I used to believe that if you did excellent work for long enough, someone eventually noticed and rewarded it. That belief carried me through 9 years at the same company, through 4 separate promotion cycles, where I was passed over in favor of people with less experience and, frankly, less skill than I had. I kept believing it anyway. Right up until the afternoon, I found out exactly why none of those promotions had ever come through, and exactly where the money that should have funded my raise had actually been going the entire time. Looking back now, I think I clung to that belief so hard precisely because the alternative was too uncomfortable to sit with, that the work itself had never been the deciding factor at all. I want to walk you through how I found that out because the answer wasn't the simple, discouraging story I'd told myself for years about being overlooked. It was something far more deliberate and far more specific to me than I ever let myself consider. My name is Marguerite. I was 38, a senior operations analyst at a regional healthcare logistics company, 9 years into a role I'd started at entry level and worked my way up through almost entirely on my own initiative, since formal training budgets at our company had always been thin. I want you to understand what 9 years of being passed over actually feels like, because it's a slower, quieter kind of damage than a single dramatic betrayal. Each time a promotion cycle came around, I'd prepare thoroughly, document my accomplishments carefully, and sit through a review with my manager, a man named Thaddeus, who would tell me, warmly and specifically, that my performance was strong, that leadership recognized my contributions, and that this particular cycle simply wasn't the right timing, usually citing budget constraints, or a hiring freeze, or some other explanation that always sounded reasonable enough on its own to accept. I remember the specific ritual of it, almost, how each review would end with him standing to shake my hand, telling me how much he valued having me on the team, sending me back to my desk feeling almost grateful rather than disappointed, which I understand now was exactly the intended effect. 4 times over 9 years, I heard some version of that explanation. 4 times, I watched someone else, usually someone who'd joined the team more recently than I had, get the promotion I'd been quietly working toward. I told myself each time that my turn was simply coming later than I'd hoped. I want to be honest that this is an easy story to tell yourself, especially when the person delivering the bad news is warm about it, specific about your strengths, and always promises that next cycle will be different. I remember, after the 3rd cycle, mentioning my frustration to my husband over dinner, and him asking, gently, whether I'd ever considered that the pattern itself might be the actual problem, rather than simply bad timing repeating 4 times in a row. I remember defending Thaddeus at the time, listing off all the ways he'd supported me over the years, covering for me during a difficult stretch after my mother's surgery, advocating for a flexible schedule when I needed one, always remembering details about my life that made him feel like more than just a manager. I genuinely believed at the time that those kindnesses meant something incompatible with what my husband was gently suggesting. I understand now that they weren't incompatible at all. They were, if anything, exactly the kind of goodwill that made a pattern like this one so much harder to see clearly. The 5th cycle started the way the others had, a strong self-review, a genuinely positive conversation with Thaddeus about my contributions over the past year, and his familiar promise that leadership was very supportive of my case this time. I remember the day clearly, because it was the same week our department had its annual budget review, and Thaddeus had seemed unusually distracted throughout that entire cycle, more so than in any of the previous 4 years combined. 2 weeks later, he told me the promotion budget for our department had been cut at the last minute, company-wide, and that my case, along with several others, would need to wait until the following cycle. I remember feeling something shift in me that time, differently than the previous 4. Not surprise exactly, something closer to a quiet, exhausted suspicion I hadn't let myself fully examine before. I asked, for the first time in 9 years, to see the actual budget memo he was referencing. He told me it wasn't something he could share directly, since it came from a confidential leadership discussion, but that he'd summarize the relevant parts for me if I wanted. I said I did. He gave me a vague, general explanation about company-wide cost containment that didn't include a single specific number. I want to be honest that this vagueness, more than anything in the previous 4 cycles, was what finally made me start paying closer attention. It's a strange thing, realizing after 9 years that the vaguest, least specific explanation you've ever been given is the one that finally jolts you into asking the questions you should have asked much earlier. I remember going home that night and pulling out old performance review documents I'd saved from every previous cycle, spreading them across my kitchen table, looking for a pattern I hadn't let myself search for before. Each review said almost the same thing, in almost the same warm, specific language, about how close I was to the next level, about how supportive leadership was of my case, about how this particular cycle simply wasn't the right timing. Reading 4 years of nearly identical language back to back, in one sitting, hit differently than hearing it once a year, spaced out enough that the repetition never fully registered before. Once I started actually looking, instead of simply accepting each explanation as it came, a pattern I'd never let myself examine started coming into focus. Every person who had been promoted over me across those 4 previous cycles had joined the team after I had, and every one of them, I now realized, had been placed under a different direct supervisor within our department before their promotion went through. Meaning Thaddeus, specifically, was never the one signing off on promoting anyone he directly managed. Except me. I had remained under his direct supervision the entire 9 years, through every single reorganization our department had gone through, an arrangement that had always been explained to me as continuity, since I knew the workflows better than anyone, and it made sense for me to stay put, while newer hires rotated through different supervisors for training purposes. I'd accepted that explanation for years without questioning it. Sitting with it now, freshly suspicious, it started to look less like continuity and more like something else entirely, a structure that conveniently kept me permanently under the one manager who, cycle after cycle, was the one telling me my promotion wasn't happening. I brought my growing suspicion to a coworker in human resources, a careful, quietly observant man named Cassius, who I'd known for years in the ordinary, friendly way you know people in an adjacent department, without ever having discussed anything this sensitive with him before. I don't want to accuse anyone of anything without being fair about it, I told him. I just want to understand whether what I'm noticing is actually a pattern, or whether I'm reading too much into 9 years of ordinary bad luck. Cassius, to his credit, didn't dismiss the question or rush to reassure me. He pulled up what he was authorized to access, aggregate promotion data across our department, without individual compensation details, which required a higher clearance than his role carried. Even that limited view confirmed something uncomfortable. Our department's promotion rate for employees under Thaddeus's direct supervision was significantly lower than the company-wide average, while employees who rotated briefly through his team before moving to a different supervisor were promoted at a rate noticeably higher than that same average. I remember watching his face as he scrolled through the numbers, the particular stillness of someone who works in HR and understands, better than most, how easily a pattern like this can hide in plain sight, simply because nobody thinks to ask the specific question that would expose it. I've pulled reports like this before, for other reasons, he said quietly. I've just never had a reason to sort it exactly this way, by supervisor tenure against promotion timing. It's a strange thing to notice only once someone finally asks the right question out loud. That's a real pattern, Cassius said carefully. I want to be honest that I don't know what's causing it. It could be a coincidence in how your team happens to be structured. It could be something else. I'm not in a position to access the details that would tell us which one it is. I almost let the conversation end there, grateful simply to have my suspicion partially confirmed, until Cassius mentioned something almost as an aside, something he clearly hadn't initially considered relevant to my question. There's one other thing, he said. It's probably unrelated, but our department's been flagged twice in the last 2 years for using an external training and development vendor that HR corporate never formally approved through our usual vendor onboarding process. It came up during a routine compliance sweep, but nothing came of it at the time, because the amounts involved were small enough to fall under a threshold that didn't require additional review. What vendor? I asked, not yet understanding why the question mattered. Something called Meridian Growth Partners, he said, listed as a leadership coaching and professional development consultancy. I only remember the name because it came up twice in the same compliance report, which is unusual for a vendor that small. I didn't recognize the name. I had never once, in 9 years, been offered leadership coaching or professional development through any vendor, formally approved or otherwise. I spent the following weekend doing exactly what I'd learned, by that point, to do with any name that didn't quite add up. I looked it up, patiently, through every public record I could access. Meridian Growth Partners was registered as a single-member consultancy, incorporated 4 years earlier, with a business address that turned out to be a residential property in a suburb I recognized immediately, because it was the same neighborhood, on the same street, where Thaddeus lived. The registered owner's name wasn't Thaddeus directly. It was his brother-in-law, a man with no visible professional background in leadership coaching or corporate training of any kind, according to the sparse public profile I could find for him. His profile listed a job title at an unrelated retail company, with no mention of Meridian Growth Partners anywhere on it at all, as though the consultancy existed entirely on paper, for exactly one client, invisible everywhere except the invoices themselves. I sat with that discovery at my kitchen table for a long time, the same table where I'd spread out 4 years of nearly identical performance reviews weeks earlier. It felt, in a strange way, like the 2 piles of paper belonged to the same story, finally connecting into one shape. The warm reassurances on one side, and the quiet, deliberate financial arrangement on the other, each one explaining why the other had been necessary for as long as it had lasted. I brought this back to Cassius, who, once he understood what I'd found, agreed to help me push further through a more formal internal channel, since what we were now looking at wasn't simply an unfair promotion pattern, but a possible financial arrangement benefiting Thaddeus personally, through funds that were supposed to be allocated to employee development and, I suspected, to the promotion budget I'd been told didn't exist this cycle. Cassius, working carefully within what he was authorized to access, along with a contact he trusted in finance, eventually pieced together the fuller shape of what had been happening. Over the previous 3 years, our department had paid Meridian Growth Partners a series of invoices for leadership development workshops and team coaching sessions, totaling just over $90,000, all approved directly by Thaddeus, all falling just below the dollar threshold that would have triggered mandatory secondary review under our company's standard vendor policy. No employee under Thaddeus's supervision, myself included, had any record of attending a single one of these workshops. When Cassius's contact in finance quietly asked a few other department members, informally, whether they remembered any leadership coaching sessions from an outside vendor, nobody could recall anything of the sort. The invoices were real, the payments were real, the actual services, as far as anyone could determine, simply didn't exist. Here's the piece that finally connected everything for me, the twist underneath the twist I hadn't expected, until Cassius laid it out plainly. Our department's promotion budget each cycle was calculated, in part, based on remaining discretionary spending within a shared budget line that also covered training and professional development costs. Every dollar routed to Meridian Growth Partners for phantom coaching sessions was a dollar that no longer existed in the same budget line Thaddeus repeatedly told me had been cut or constrained whenever my promotion came up. I sat with that sentence longer than almost anything else in this entire story, turning it over until the full, deliberate shape of it settled somewhere. I couldn't unsee it. 9 years of not this cycle hadn't been bad luck, or budget cycles, or timing outside anyone's control. It had been arithmetic, quietly rigged in one specific direction, cycle after cycle, by the one person whose job was supposedly to advocate for me. He hadn't just been keeping me under his direct supervision to control my promotion path directly. He'd been quietly siphoning the exact funds that should have covered raises and promotions into a shell consultancy owned by his own brother-in-law, and using the resulting budget shortfall as his ready-made, plausible excuse every single cycle my case came up for review. I remember sitting with Cassius in a quiet corner of the office cafeteria when he laid out the final piece of the timeline, the two of us speaking in lowered voices, even though nobody nearby had any reason to be listening. 3 years, he said, almost to himself, shaking his head slightly. 3 years of invoices, Always just under the threshold, always timed a few weeks before your review cycle came up. That's not carelessness. That's someone who understood the review threshold well enough to stay just beneath it every single time. I asked him how someone gets that specific, that consistent, without ever once being caught by ordinary oversight. He didn't have a satisfying answer, only the same observation I'd already started to accept myself. Most internal controls are built to catch large, obvious theft, not small, patient, well-timed withdrawals dressed up as something legitimate. Thaddeus hadn't needed to be a genius. He'd only needed to understand exactly where the threshold sat, and enough patience to never once test it, cycle after cycle, for 3 full years, without ever once feeling the pressure to move faster or take more than the arrangement could comfortably hide. I sat with all of this for several days before deciding what to do, and I want to be honest about the version of this story I almost told instead. Part of me wanted to walk directly into Thaddeus's office and lay everything out in front of him, watch 9 years of warm, reasonable explanations finally collapse in real time in front of me. I wanted that confrontation badly, the specific satisfaction of finally saying, out loud, exactly what I now understood he'd been doing to me. Cassius talked me out of it, gently but firmly. The moment you confront him directly, he said, he has time to quietly cancel the vendor relationship, adjust the invoices, or simply have his brother-in-law disappear from any further paperwork before we can formally document what's actually happening. Right now, you have a real pattern and a real paper trail. A private confrontation gives him time to make both of those things harder to prove. So instead, we built a clean, factual document, the promotion pattern data, the vendor registration tied to Thaddeus's brother-in-law, the invoice history falling suspiciously below the review threshold, and the budget line connection tying the missing funds directly to the same promotion budget I'd been told didn't exist. And I requested a meeting, not with Thaddeus, and not with the general HR channel that had already quietly flagged this vendor twice without meaningful follow-up, but directly with our division's senior vice president of operations, a measured woman named Beatrix who oversaw multiple departments, including ours, and had no direct reporting relationship with Thaddeus at all. Beatrix read through everything in near silence for almost 20 minutes, while Cassius and I sat across from her saying very little, letting the documentation do exactly what it needed to do. "Walk me through this vendor registration again," she said finally, tapping the business filing page. "You're telling me the sole owner of this consultancy is your manager's brother-in-law, and every invoice from this company was personally approved by that same manager. That's what the public record and the invoice history show," I said, "and no employee under his supervision has any record of attending a single session this vendor was supposedly paid to provide." She was quiet for a long moment, the specific quiet of someone doing real math in her head, recalculating 9 years of budget reports and promotion decisions she'd likely signed off on without ever noticing the pattern sitting underneath them. She asked to see the invoice history again, more slowly this time, tracing each date with her finger against a printed calendar she'd pulled from a drawer, muttering the review cycle dates under her breath as she matched them against each payment. "And you're saying this vendor spending directly reduced the discretionary budget line. Your promotion case was repeatedly evaluated against," she said, sliding the budget documentation toward the center of the table. "I'm telling you what the documentation shows," I said. "I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the timing, and about why I happen to be the one employee who was never rotated to a different supervisor in 9 years. She was quiet again before finally speaking. "I want you to understand something," she said. "I've approved department-level budget summaries for years that included this line item without ever asking detailed questions about what specifically it funded. That's on me as much as it's on him. I'm going to need everything you have, formally, and I'm going to need to bring in internal audit and HR compliance before this goes any further." I asked her, before I left her office, what would happen to my own case in the meantime, since we were technically still mid-cycle on the promotion decision that had started this entire investigation. "Your case is being reviewed by me directly starting today," she said. "It's no longer going through Thaddeus at all. I don't think you should have to wait through a formal audit timeline to get an answer you were owed 9 years ago." I didn't expect that answer, and I want to be honest that it undid something in me for a moment. Sitting in her office, hearing someone with real authority say plainly that 9 years was too long, rather than simply promising, once again, that next time would be different. Beatrix moved quickly once she understood the scope of what she was looking at. Within a week, an internal audit was launched, examining every invoice paid to Meridian Growth Partners over the full 3 years of its relationship with our department. Thaddeus was placed on administrative leave within days, a decision made well above his own authority to influence or delay. The audit ultimately confirmed everything Cassius and I had found, and identified an additional, smaller pattern of expense reimbursements that similarly benefited Thaddeus personally, unrelated to the vendor scheme, but discovered as part of the broader review once auditors started looking closely at his approvals more generally. I was promoted within the same quarter, along with a formal written correction to my personnel file acknowledging that my case had been repeatedly and improperly delayed. I didn't get to watch the meeting where Thaddeus was formally terminated, and honestly, by that point, I didn't need to. I'd gotten what I actually came for, 9 years of delayed recognition, finally, undeniably, on the record. Cassius told me, weeks later, that the internal audit had also recommended a policy change requiring managers to rotate direct reports to a different supervisor at least once every 3 years, specifically to prevent the kind of prolonged, unchecked authority that had let this situation continue for as long as it did. I felt a strange, complicated satisfaction hearing that, knowing the exact structural loophole that had cost me 9 years might now protect whoever came after me from the same thing. It didn't undo the 9 years. It just meant, going forward, that nobody else in that building would have to sit through 4 cycles of the same warm, reasonable excuse before finally understanding what it had actually been covering. If you've ever spent years believing a reasonable-sounding excuse, only to find out later it was covering for something far more deliberate, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribe, because there's more coming. I think, more than anything, about the specific kind of patience that scheme required from Thaddeus. 9 years of consistently warm, specific, believable explanations, carefully timed to never quite cross into something I'd feel entitled to formally challenge. I used to think patience like that was a virtue. I understand now that it can just as easily be a tool, wielded by someone who understands exactly how long a reasonable person will wait before finally asking the one question that unravels everything. I called my husband the evening Beatrix confirmed my promotion, and I could hear, in the particular quality of his silence before he spoke, that he was resisting the urge to point out he'd been the one to first suggest, years earlier over that dinner, that the pattern itself might be the actual problem. He didn't say it outright, and I loved him a little more for choosing not to. Instead, he just asked, quietly, how it actually felt, finally having the answer after so many years of almost having it. I told him the truth, which surprised me a little even as I said it out loud. It didn't feel like triumph, exactly. It felt like relief, mostly. The specific, bone-deep relief of finally being able to stop silently auditing every kind thing a manager had ever done for me, wondering which version of the relationship had actually been real. I still think about that distinction sometimes, the difference between relief and triumph, and I've come to believe relief is the more honest response to finally being believed after 9 years of quietly wondering if you were the problem.